Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back. Today we have a brand new guest on, Seth Heasley. He's here to discuss the Misery novel. And Seth, why don't you just let the listeners know a little bit about yourself before we dive into the book?
Sounds good. And thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
I am another podcaster. I actually have 3 podcasts now that not many people listen to. I have one called Take Me to Your Reader that I do with a couple of my friends where we talk about adapted science fiction. So we've actually covered Firestarter, which I know you previously covered.
That's a good one.
And then I have the Hugo's There podcast, which is kind of it's not my latest one, but it's the one that I spend most of my time on now, because in that one, I'm kind of doing like random trek on the Incomparable, where I have a guest on and I let them choose a title off the list of Hugo winners. And then we discuss those. And then my son wanted to do a podcast about movies with me. So we started that one, and it's called Brief and Not So Brief, where we either talk about several films that may or may not be related, and not for very long for each film, or we kind of do more of a deep dive into a single film. So that's been kind of fun.
Nice. Lots of podcasting going on over on your end then.
Yep.
The only way we know.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and dive on into Misery. For me, this was my first time reading this book, and as you know, I am going through this chronologically, and quite a bit of the stuff for me is going to be the first time I'm reading through a lot of it, even though I've been familiar with Stephen King for quite a few years now. So what led you to Stephen King's books, and when did you first end up reading Misery?
Sure. So I've never been a huge Stephen King fan, actually. I really have not read many of his books. Growing up, I had a friend who always read whatever he put out, and I don't know, I was in kind of a conservative Christian family in Anchorage, and people who read Stephen King were eyed with suspicion, you know. And so I'm not sure I ever read anything prior to. I think I picked up an audiobook of The Gunslinger, like back in, I don't know, 2002 or so. And, you know, that was it. And then I think when 11/22/63 came out, I saw that it was kind of alternate history / time travel. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe this will be a good place to jump onto some Stephen King. Read that one, enjoyed it. And then, like I said, we covered Firestarter for Take Me to Your Reader. And boy, I think that is it. I had at some point picked up Misery. I have a Barnes & Noble Nook, and it was, $1.99 one time, and picked it up and thought, okay, I'd seen the movie. So I thought, okay, this is a known property. Maybe I'll enjoy this. But the fact is I've just never been much of a horror fan. I always tell people I just kind of have a weak mind. I'm very prone to nightmares. And so I tread very lightly when it comes to scary stuff.
Yeah, I have a few friends who are like that, and it makes them not really want to dive into Stephen King and his work as a whole. So what I do is I'm like, okay, let me pick out the novels for you that aren't really horror driven. And while Misery is kind of horror driven, it's not anything like Pennywise in It or, these crazy monsters that are coming about or anything like that.
It's not supernatural horror, right? And that's kind of the line I draw, where I don't love supernatural horror.
Yeah, and another guest on this podcast, Becky Kovac, she is more into the fantasy world. So The Dark Tower is like totally up her alley, and then not so much for a lot of the other novels. But because he has branched out here and there, and I find that some of his stories are done best when he just focuses on the people, like when you have short stories like Shawshank Redemption and The Body, those sort of stories that you can have horrific things happen without having your typical horror elements in the story.
Right.
Those things really stand out. And a lot of people don't even realize those are Stephen King works. And I would be curious to know if a lot of people know that Misery came from a Stephen King book, because like you said, to you, it was a known property. You had seen the movie, so you knew. But I know some people who didn't realize Shawshank or Stand By Me were movies based off of Stephen King works, because if you're not paying too close attention to the credits, it's definitely easy to miss at the beginning. And it just really feels like that Misery has the potential to be one of those, but I personally haven't seen the movie yet.
Sure. Oh, okay.
It's one of those things where I was like, I know Kathy Bates is in this because, I've seen that kind of iconic cover and poster over the years, but I have never actually sat down to watch the movie. So to me, it would be interesting to see how many people didn't realize it was a Stephen King property.
Right. Well, the other thing is, and I think it's germane to the book, is we tend to put authors in little boxes, right? This person writes this kind of book. Right. I either like it or I don't. If I don't like it, I just steer clear of it. If I do like it, then I don't want him to stray from writing that kind of book.
Yeah, people do that a lot with music too. They're like, I like this band because they play this music. And if they play anything other than, what's on this album that I really, really love, I don't like it. And then they, have some sort of resentment towards these musicians. And it's like, okay, guys, calm down. If they made something you like, you can still like that and not have to like everything. And I think Stephen King is a prime example of that.
And that comes into film adaptations as well, right? Where you have people who are fanatical about a book, and then they'll see it as a film and think, oh, they ruined it. And I always want to go, well, no, the book still exists. They just made a bad movie or a bad adaptation, or maybe it's a good movie. It's just not what you wanted. So yeah, it's human nature.
Of course. Let's go ahead and dive into the story. This isn't a super, super long book by Stephen King standards. The mass market paperback copy that I had was maybe close to 340 pages. I think it came in just shy of 340. And once you sit down and really get into it, it's sort of a breeze to read because for the most part, you're spending time with two people. Paul Sheldon, a writer, and his number one fan, Annie Wilkes, who finds him on the side of the road after a terrible accident. And she takes him in and basically keeps him prisoner so that he can write a new novel just for her. And Stephen King can get very meta sometimes, especially when he's writing about writers. And you could tell that was coming through in this story. And it was just fascinating, the character work he was able to do with these two characters, given the one location that they were in for, pretty much the entirety of the story. And you could just feel the crazy sort of just situation that this was oozing off of the pages. You're like, wow, Annie is really, really unstable. And he wrote that so well. To where, even though I haven't seen the movie, I just kept picturing Kathy Bates saying all of these things and doing all of these things in my head. And I think that's kind of amazing, given the fact that I haven't even seen the movie. Just the fact that, it's like, oh, okay, I kind of have an idea of what this character is supposed to look like now. And the same with Paul Sheldon. So it makes things a little easier when you're reading the book. And it's not to say that, my opinion of the book was colored by the movie because I haven't seen it. So I just know the faces associated.
Kathy Bates has one of those faces that you could see saying cockadoodie.
Yes. I think that might be my favorite phrase that he has made up.
Yes. Yeah. I've been using it in regular conversation recently. I think I used oogie in a sentence in the last week.
Yeah. It was just so funny that it turned out that way while I was reading it. It's kind of like when I read Fight Club after having seen the movie. It's just like everything was either in Edward Norton's voice or Brad Pitt's voice. And while I did see the full movie before reading the book, it just seemed very funny to me that I was kind of having this sort of deja vu without really having it. And, Annie lives in pretty much the middle of nowhere.
Right.
In Colorado. So the town that Paul was in was, I believe, Sidewinder, which I'm not entirely sure is a real town in Colorado. I did not look it up, but, he tends to sort of take these real places and just sort of make up names for them like he's done with Castle Rock and Derry and what have you. So I thought that taking things back to Colorado after The Shining taking place there was very interesting because The Shining does come up in this. So you have this story that takes place within this same universe, obviously. That hotel and that book are referenced, those characters and everything. So what we come to find out is that Annie's instability goes much further than we're initially led to believe. At first, for
Yeah.
me anyway, I just thought she was this number one fan. And
Mm-hmm.
as we read more and more, we find out that isn't quite the case. So, what did you think of Annie as a character and how she was portrayed?
I mean, I think she's just one of the best characters I've read in any book. Just the way she's drawn and the way she talks, even at the very beginning. And I was coming into this having previously seen the movie, so I knew that there was going to be a reveal that she was unstable. But I like how quickly Paul Sheldon cottons to that and is like, "Ooh, okay, I got to tread lightly here because the fact that she didn't bring me to a hospital means something. The fact that she's talking about how she's my number one fan. This is troubling, and all the detail that Stephen King goes into in kind of building her out. It's almost like world building, but on a character level. And just like we were talking about before, right? The turns of phrase like cockadoodie and oogie, and building this character that has a real problem with profanity, but is pretty cavalier about murder. That's a fascinating kind of character bit there.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, you also have the fact that she is so obsessed with a fictional character that she would
Yes.
go to these extremes because she is upset that Paul killed off Misery in his last Misery novel. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, 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 you can't do that. You need to
Yeah.
write a book. And the funny thing is, Paul ends up writing what he thinks is a pretty good book, or he's at least telling her that, and she thinks it's a really good book
Yeah.
because of this solitude that he has. And I've read, about the habits of various writers over the years, especially Stephen King himself, and it seems like
Mm-hmm.
that solitude is something a lot of them use to their advantage, whether or not it's really healthy for someone to spend that much
Yeah.
time in solitude or not is another thing. But living where Stephen King does, I wouldn't say Bangor, Maine is in the middle of nowhere necessarily, but
Yeah.
I believe I looked it up, and as of 2010, the census there was a little over 30,000 people. So it's still
Okay.
a relatively small city in
Yeah.
comparison to,
More of a town than a city, right?
yeah, in comparison to a lot of places, at least
Mm-hmm.
around me in Southern California. I don't know if there's a single city in Southern California that only has 33,000 people.
Yeah. See, now I had remembered from seeing the movie that she had already read the book where he killed off Misery.
Okay.
And so I was delighted that she read it during the course of this story because I was trying to figure out if she either hadn't read that yet or if she had read it previously, how that would have changed how they dealt with each other. Because once she was able to give him the task of resurrecting Misery, that was kind of his way to survive.
Right.
And I don't know that he would have had such an easy time of it if he hadn't had that kind of motivating thing going on.
Yeah, if she had not known what was going to happen at all and,
Mm-hmm.
sort of just had the book sitting on a shelf, and especially if maybe she even waited a bit and then read it when he was starting to heal up a little more, it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
how would she have reacted in those moments?
Yeah.
Because we saw how she reacted in much more minor moments, I guess you could say. She literally
Yes.
starts chopping body parts off of him. So,
Yeah.
with an axe, it's not
Yeah.
very sanitary or anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's earlier signals too, and this goes back to the how the character is drawn, right? Where she's very manic, where she'll just kind of shut down, and Paul learns to just don't react to it, just wait until she comes back. But and then kind of I think the first time she really deliberately hurts him is when she goes to get the paper for him. When he tells her that the paper that she's gotten for him to use to write the book just won't do,
Mm-hmm.
and he thinks he's gotten one over on her. And as she's leaving, she just cracks down on his knee with something, and I think she says something to him. Yeah, she says, "So
Yeah.
you just sit here, or you just sit there and you think about who's in charge here and all the bad things I can do to you if you behave badly or try to trick me. You sit there and you scream if you want to because no one can hear you. No one stops you because they know Annie Wilkes is crazy. They all know what she did, even if they did find me innocent." I just thought that was a great little speech that she gave. And this was after she had left him alone, right, for almost 2 days.
Right.
Did she leave him with any pain medication at all? I don't think she did.
I don't think so, because there was that time where he went out to sort of search around because she had just left him there with like no food, nothing. And he finds the stash of pills.
Right.
And then you have all of these moments where Paul is really just in survival mode here, and he notices that the wheelchair left marks on, sort of the door frame
on the door
area.
jamb. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he hopes she doesn't notice, even though he's like, well, she probably did. And we find out later that she did indeed know that he had left the room numerous times, because she would leave like tiny strands of hair or thread, and then they would be broken. And, she went to some extreme lengths to keep him there. But the fact that Paul was able to stay in survivalist mode as long as he did is a testament to how much he eventually ended up wanting to just finish the book too. He knew that if he didn't finish the book, or even when he did finish the book, it would be the end of everything. And so he took his time with the book, which, since it's something that she wanted, it wouldn't have made sense for her to rush him. And she had moments where, she was kind of like interested in what he was doing, but didn't understand the process and didn't care about the process. And he points that out. And, he's sort of just like, you kind of have to let me do my thing. Otherwise, this is going to suck and you're going to hate it. So let me make it good for you and let me do it how I do things. And that convinces her to not necessarily be nice to him, because, again, she's holding him prisoner, basically, and kills plenty of other people along the way.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and she's kind of the classic abuser, right? Where she'll hurt him and then tell him why it was his fault.
Yeah.
Or hurt other people and blame him for it as well.
Yeah, she just has a way of manipulating people.
Yeah.
Even if they know she's full of crap. And I feel like that's sort of how she was found innocent. There was just enough reasonable doubt there to where they couldn't convict her, but they probably all knew that she was guilty.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting too, the kind of the motivation for Paul to do the writing. There's two sides of it. It's almost presented like a drug addiction, which is of course in direct parallel to him taking the Novril for his pain, which he realizes at some point, I'm not taking it anymore for the pain. I'm taking it for, because I'm hooked on it. But one of the things that I loved about King's writing was the way he talked about the pain and the tide rising and falling. In that imagery of him at the beach and seeing that ratty old pier or ratty old piling, come as the tide went out. And I just thought that was a brilliant way to not have to keep saying the pain came back, the pain went away, the pain came back, the pain went away.
Yeah, and addiction is something that Stephen King clearly had an understanding about, because the 80s were really fueled by cocaine for him. And I don't know if this novel in particular was, but I know the earlier 80s novels and movies like Cujo and those ones definitely were. But in this, you just get this really grounded in reality story. Like you said, there's not really any supernatural elements to this. The most sort of elemental thing to it is the snowstorm that causes the crash, So there isn't anything really weird going on here aside from Annie's obsession. But at the same time, there are people out there who are like Annie. There are plenty of serial killers that have, become infamous over the years, and Annie basically became that. And it's just not as typical for it to be a woman, but at the same time, Annie really sort of just embodies everything that there is to sort of be feared about someone.
Well, I remember seeing news reports in the 80s about, the quote angel of death, where there was a nurse that had done, I'm not sure if it was similar things to what Annie had done, but where, people had died on her watch more than the usual rate. And so that's, if you're going to have a serial killer, character in a book, then that's one way that it's it doesn't strain credulity to imagine that you might have somebody like that. If you have somebody as unbalanced as Annie, who's in a healthcare profession, she can convince herself that she's doing people a favor and, disconnecting their equipment or giving them a shot of something they shouldn't have.
Yeah, and she clearly isn't really working at the time either. So
Right.
she is all alone out there. She gets desperate and she is not afraid to, go after cops. She kills a cop with the lawnmower. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's one of the most brutal scenes in this because
yes.
she just has a complete disregard for authority and no one can tell her what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is even before the lawnmower comes into it, the way she goes at him with it's like a grave marker or something, isn't it? It's a stake more or less.
Yeah.
It was nasty.
And even the way she cuts off, Paul's foot and then cauterizes it with a blowtorch. And it's just so visual the way Stephen King writes it. And then she cuts off one of his thumbs with an electric knife. And you're just like, oh, geez, she is just doing these things in the most brutal way possible, even though she was a nurse and would know, like more sanitary ways to do these things.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about that because, we've talked about how this is a very self-contained story, right? Where you basically just have the two characters for most of the time. And then there's the vignettes from the actual writing of the novel. But it's also very linear, where it just kind of starts at the beginning and there's a few reminiscences about things here and there. But then all of a sudden he alludes to the fact that he's missing a thumb. And I thought, oh, did I miss the part where she cut off his thumb? But then it turns out that he just kind of went non-linear for that portion.
Yeah.
Where he skipped ahead to the thumb was off and then went back to leading up to it. And I thought it was clever because it then had me anticipating, oh, is this the moment that she does it? Oh, no, she doesn't. Okay. And then later on she does it. And it's very matter of fact, right? She's not even angry at the moment that she cuts his thumb off.
Yeah. Overall, I just really love the structure of this story. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the little bits of the novel. So let's go ahead and talk about the novel within the novel, because you can tell right away that something is slightly off because you're looking at these pages from a typewriter, but then you have letters being filled in.
Yes.
I believe at the start it is the letter E. And
no, it was the letter N.
Letter N. Okay. It's E eventually. It's like N, T, and E by the end of things. Yes. And those are like three of the most common letters that you could have. So he is doing all of this work, and sometimes he's the one filling in the N's, sometimes she's filling in the N's, and later the T's and the E's. And at first it took me out of the book a little bit because I was like, oh my goodness, just my eyes don't want to look at this. Yeah. And there was a portion that was completely handwritten as well later on when he's doing, longhand on the notepads and everything. And I was like, wow, this was a struggle. And at the same time, though, even though it was a struggle for me to read, especially the handwritten portion, you really get a sense of what the struggle was like for Paul when you're reading the novel within the novel and the notes and everything like that. Because, you find out that he's missing a thumb and that these keys are broken on the typewriter, and he is too afraid to bother her about it. And that is why he lost his thumb. Basically, he complained about the typewriter, which you would think, not that you would expect Annie to think rationally about anything, but you would think that if she really wanted the book as badly as she did, having him have everything he needed in, tip-top shape would kind of be a priority. But, it's like, okay, if you and I were typing on a keyboard and even one of the keys didn't work, we'd be going down to, the Apple Store or Best Buy or wherever and being like, can you fix this? Or buying a new one.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you read this one in physical, like hardcover or paperback?
Yeah, I had the mass market paperback.
Okay. Because I was reading this on the Nook version and there is no handwritten portion in it. Probably because it was difficult to digitize.
Yeah, it was only like one page, I think, 1 or 2 pages towards the end there, but it's when he is, I believe, down in the cellar. She's like hiding him. So he is kind of just going by daylight, I guess, from the little window up there. And, there's probably not a desk down there, I would imagine. So he's not going to have somewhere to put the typewriter or anything like that. And I think it was just, 1 or 2 pages, but it was in like cursive handwriting. And I was just like, oh my goodness, I can't tell what some of these letters are. So I was like, it took me such a long time just to read those 2 pages in comparison to everything else. I was like, it almost took me out of the story, but thankfully it didn't, because it just solidifies everything Paul was dealing with, not only while trying to write this novel, but just trying to survive.
Yeah. I did find it a little distracting the first time that I read one of the sections of Misery's Return, where my eye was drawn every time to the hand-drawn N on all the words. But it really does hammer home to you how common that letter is, right? And then when it gets to the T and the E, you're like, well, okay, it's getting ridiculous now. And of course, then he doesn't even ask for a replacement, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Did you have some pages that just didn't have the letters filled in at all yet? Because I was reading one of those sections too, and I was like, oh my goodness, please fill in the letters here.
Yeah, that was when it was kind of, that's as it happened, right?
Yeah.
Where he had to decide, okay, do I complain about this or not? Or just start going longhand.
Right. Yeah. And I was just like, okay, well, clearly someone has to fill in the letters, because there's no way Stephen King is going to make us read this missing N's, T's, and E's. And sometimes you're probably just like, I think this is the right word.
It was fascinating to me to remember, I grew up during the 80s, I'm a 70s kid. And so, I remember long handwriting assignments, where you'd be writing things longhand in class, and not even necessarily for handwriting, but, like essays and that kind of stuff where your hand starts to cramp. And when it got to that part of the book where his hand is actually swelling from how much he's having to actually handwrite things, it's just like, oh man, I can feel that in my bones.
And it's something that today you and I don't really have to experience, because that doesn't happen when you're typing on a computer keyboard, unless you're going to some sort of extreme.
And you get tired of all the signatures on the paperwork.
Yeah. And sometimes I find myself taking notes in a notebook, like while I'm just watching a movie or something, and just jotting down notes for 2.5 hours. I'm like, wow, my hand is very tired, because it's not used to this kind of motion for more than a couple seconds at a time. And you really resonate with that, especially if you've done any sort of assignments longhand. And for whatever reason, I had done quite a few of those. I don't know if it's because I went to Montessori school and they just really wanted you to practice your cursive writing there. But, they would just have you writing the same letter over and over and over and over again. So like you, even though, I was not around at the same time as this novel taking place, it was something that I could relate to at least a little bit as well. But one other thing I want to talk about in regards to this story is the pacing of the novel. We mentioned that we really liked how it was structured, but I think it was also paced pretty well.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. The fascinating thing for me was I'd get to the parts of the book where he's actually writing the book, and I think, well, this is not my kind of book. I don't read the kind of books that Paul Sheldon writes. But I was so engrossed in the story that I was reading it with an eye to, is this going to be good enough for Annie? And looking at it through that lens and going, is she going to appreciate this story? It seems pretty good to me, but is she going to like it?
Yeah, I would say the first excerpt of, the new Misery novel, it took me a little bit to get into it, but I warmed up to those more and more as the story went along. And I think that's a testament to Stephen King just really knowing when to put those in, because when I read the first one, I was like, oh no, how much of this book is going to be a different book? Because you never know how meta Stephen King is going to get. And it wouldn't be that surprising if he had done that more often than he did, but I'm really glad he didn't. And I think it just added a lot more to my enjoyment of the book, how well it was paced, and how I never really felt bored being in the same place with these two characters, because sometimes you watch a movie and it really only takes place in like one house or something like that. And those movies can get a little too boring if you drag certain scenes on too long. But with
Yeah.
this, because he was writing a novel, you could take those little breaks from Paul and Annie's world to just spend a few pages in Misery's world and get a little update there and then return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious what the writing process was like, because you can make an argument that Annie is the author's stand-in for his editor, right?
Right.
Where he could have made this novel where it was a full novel within a novel, where we end up reading the entire Misery's Return,
Mm-hmm.
start to finish. But he didn't, and I'm curious: was that his decision? Was that him working with an editor? Was it his wife? Was it someone giving him that feedback? And it kind of goes into, like you said, right? He can get pretty meta at times, and there really is a lot of meta commentary in this book. I'm not sure how much of it is intentional, because I know that a lot of fans read this book and said, "Oh, he hates us." Okay, that's great.
I could see why some of them would say that, but I think Annie is way too interesting of a character
Yes.
to have just made it all about the novel itself. It was
Mm-hmm.
much more about Annie's feelings towards Misery. And, as fans, I'm sure you and I have both thought at some point, oh, well, maybe if they had done this, I would have liked this better. And,
Mm-hmm.
we aren't the kind of fan that Annie is. We are not
Right.
that sort of manipulative and thinking that, oh, he was writing this for me, or,
Mm-hmm.
she was writing this for me, or what have you. Instead, I think with us, it's like we come at it from more of just a fan loving side of things, not a
Yeah.
fan obsessive side of things. It's like, yes, I really like Marvel and DC and all of these various shows that are coming out. I really love them, but I wouldn't say that, I would be upset if I didn't like any one of those superhero shows on the CW or something. It's like, okay, not everything is for me. That's fine. Move
Yeah.
on, read something else. But Annie could not move on from
Mm-mm.
Misery's death and the way that was rolled out to us. It's like he didn't waste any time getting into Annie being his number one fan, Paul's number one
Right.
fan, that is. And
Mm-hmm.
from there, it's just like things moved pretty quickly, even when Paul was spending days in the room by himself, because he was sort of alone with his thoughts and we were getting a lot of those thoughts out on the page.
Yeah.
It went by much faster. It never felt like, oh, this is dragging on.
Yeah, it's interesting to be in the head of Paul Sheldon and by proxy in the head of Stephen King when he's talking about, falling into the hole in the paper, right? And I mean, I'm not a writer. I've written plenty, but I'm not a writer by trade. And so to be able to kind of get into the headspace of a best-selling author, and even the notion, right, that I write two kinds of novels, good ones and bestsellers, where he's got that dichotomy thing going where if it's popular, it can't be good. Like that seems to be what he's convinced himself. And so at the beginning of the novel, he's just written his great novel, right, where misery is just the trash that paid the bills. And
Yeah.
he's probably, his analysis may not be correct on those. And I think critics and fans, we can get too highfalutin sometimes and say, well, I'm going to be a hipster and say, well, I don't like Stephen King. He's too popular. I like this, indie horror author.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. Let's go ahead and talk about some favorite moments from the book. I know we've brought up a few here, and I think for me, a lot of them came when Paul was sort of just by himself, even though Annie is such a great character.
Mm-hmm.
Everything she does is just so horrible to him for the most part. It's hard
Yes.
to really want those to be favorite moments, but I think Paul getting out and exploring and going and finding out all of this information about Annie and really knowing who she is now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the great moments in the book for me.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I have two thoughts about this, where I like the portions where he was out exploring the house.
Mm-hmm.
I love the part where he finds the drugs and he doses himself immediately and then just, goes to La La Land for a while he's out there vulnerable in the house. And you find that the Annie in his head is every bit of as terrifying as the real Annie.
Yeah.
Because he's imagining her coming back at any moment, right? But on the other hand, some of the stuff I'll preface this by saying this is a quick read. It's not an overlong book. If this was a longer book, I might think, did we need for him to find the notebook with all the clippings in it of all her killing?
Uh-huh.
Because I feel like the oblique references to it were enough. So, like I said, I mean, if it was a longer book, then I'd be like, okay, well, maybe we could have cut something. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if that's in the movie. It might have been something that they cut.
Okay.
But on the other hand, she's such a great character. It is fascinating to see him read through that stuff and then see kind of how proud she is that he did find it and that she set a trap for him, because he's Mr. Smart Guy, right? With all capital letters.
Yeah, some of her just terms for either Paul or just in general that she uses are pretty entertaining, even if the character is still terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I think I really enjoyed the end of the book, as he tries to make his escape. He comes up with his plan to burn the manuscript, right?
Yeah.
And I remember when I was reading it, I thought, wow, that's hardcore. I didn't think he would do that again, right? Because she had made him burn fast cars.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he fooled me with that one because Paul, of course, had saved the manuscript. But
I'll admit, he got me with that one too.
Yeah. And she's very formidable, right? And so even when he hits her in the back with that typewriter, where he had been kind of surreptitiously working out to try and get himself some stamina so that he'd be able to try and take her on, and then gets out of the room, and I think he locks himself in the bathroom at some point. But then in his mind, she's there, she's right outside the door with the axe, and the moment he leaves that, she's going to chop his head off, and then even after he actually escapes, right? The police show up and he calls them by David and Goliath, right? He doesn't use their proper names.
Right.
He's telling them she's still here. She's somewhere, because that Annie in his mind has loomed so large. And it got me to thinking of the amount of therapy that he would have to go through.
Oh, yeah.
In the years afterwards. And it made me also think of, I'm not sure that if I was him, I would ever be able to live alone again.
Mm-hmm. Especially since he spent so much time there. He wrote an entire novel, and I know even with fast writers, it's not like that's something you accomplish in a week. And I think he said at his best he was cranking out 8 or 10 pages a day maybe, and usually his output was maybe 2 or 3. So he was writing faster because he didn't have obligations. He wasn't taking phone calls. He didn't have, people to meet up with and all of these things. He was in literal
and he was living clean apart from the narcotics.
Right. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't going out to bars. He wasn't doing all of those things that really distracted him. And even when he was on the Novril, it's like he was still there. He wasn't going anywhere. So he had more time to just sit there and write and not feel obligated to do anything else, because Annie wouldn't let him do anything else. And even though Annie was around, it was still solitude for him. It was jail and it was hell.
Yes.
And he really just felt that all once he made his escape. It was sort of this overwhelming thing, and you do catch up with him after the fact, and you can tell he's still sort of going through the motions, and it's not something you just get over in a week.
One other character tidbit that I thought was just fantastic was talking about Annie singing. She'd be walking around the house singing, and it describes her as having an on-pitch but tuneless voice. And if you're not somebody who's into music, or I'm a singer, then you may not have ever experienced this, where there's different kinds of bad singing. There's bad singing, the kind of person who has no ear, and so they're never hitting the right notes. And then there's other bad singing it's a person who's hitting all the notes, but there's no style to it. There's no vocal to it.
Yeah.
And I mentioned I grew up in a conservative family, and we went to one of those churches where if you wanted to get up and sing a song on Sunday morning, there was very little process for sifting the wheat from the chaff. And so we had a couple people who'd get up there and bless us on a Sunday morning. And wow, it was that kind of thing, right? Where okay, I can see that you're hitting the notes, but there's no actual musicality to it.
Yeah, there's no real personality behind it.
Yeah.
Annie did feel like one of those characters where you could tell she didn't really have too much personality because of whatever her condition was, whether it's because she was a psychopath, sociopath, what have you. There was just something about her that even though she felt intense emotions, she didn't have much of a personality. She either swung one way or the other, and there was never really anything in between.
Yeah. Yeah. And she could switch between, I really love you, Paul, to, okay, maybe I should just kill us both right now.
Yeah.
At some point I wanted him to say to her, look, if you're going to end up dead anyway, how about you can go ahead and off yourself and I'll stay here. And we're good.
Yeah.
But I don't think logic was the right approach with Annie.
No, not at all. Logic, rationality just did not exist. And you mentioned Paul getting ready by lifting the typewriter and everything. And that was another one of my favorite moments with him because it was just so comedic and sad at the same time. It's like, this is what he is basically left with. He's going to lift this typewriter because it's the heaviest thing he has in the room, probably, other than, like trying to lift the bed up, which there was no way he would be doing something like that.
Right.
Especially sitting in a wheelchair. That's just like asking for major back pain.
Yeah. Oh, those old typewriters are not light. We had one of those in one of the rooms of our house when I was growing up. And then we had an electric one, and it wasn't light either.
Right.
The days before widely available computers. Even Paul mentions writing on a word processor, and I remember those as well, where it's not really a computer. I mean, it is a computer in the sense that it's storing the words in memory, but
it
but that's
serves
all
one
it does.
purpose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have any final thoughts here? I know we've covered quite a bit, and because this wasn't a super lengthy book, it was easy to, keep things tight here because, again, really only 2 characters, 3 if you want to count Misery as a big driving force, which I definitely would. And then you just have your sort of ancillary cops, teenagers who stop by and, drive away quickly if you're the teenagers because, they're like, oh, nope, never mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this was a great read, and I'm really thankful that you had me on to discuss it because I've been wanting to read it for a long time. It's been sitting there on my Nook for ages, and so I was really glad to get through it. One other thing that I wrote down about the book was Paul finishes Misery's Return and expresses this kind of letdown of, well, I finished it, I created something, but it's not like he feels some sense of accomplishment, which I think is interesting because when I read a book, when I finish reading a book, I do feel a sense of accomplishment. So it made me think, do I have an author, trapped in a room suffering for my reading pleasure someplace who's not even enjoying it? But I hope that's not the case.
Luckily with Stephen King, it doesn't seem to be because he keeps churning out the books.
He does. Yeah.
But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I gave it a 5 out of 5 by the time I was done with it on Goodreads because I was like, this is sort of top tier King for me. And it really just felt like my kind of novel, even though it wasn't one of his stereotypical horror novels, and like you, I feel some sort of sense of accomplishment every time I finish one of his novels, especially the really long ones. I am going to be working on the Tommyknockers shortly here, and it's over 750 pages, and many of his books are pretty lengthy. You mentioned 11/22/63, which is another lengthy one, and I have my work cut out for me, but the fact that I'm still enjoying getting through these books, for the most part, I think there have maybe been 1 or 2 that I wasn't super fond of so far, but given how many I've read at this point, I'll take that.
Yeah, well, you did It recently, right? And that's a pretty long one.
Yes, so that was about 1,100 pages.
Yeah, this is a good palate cleanser. And I feel like this is a good one if you wanted to ask a non-horror fan to read some Stephen King. This would be a good one that I'd recommend.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Seth, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. It was a lot of fun. Absolutely. And I am looking forward to checking out the movie now that, I've read the book.
Yeah, I have the Blu-ray sitting upstairs. I was wanting to watch it with my son, so
nice.
That'll be cool. And thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying what you're doing with the podcast. Like I said, I haven't read or watched a lot of the things, but when one comes on that I have, or one that I'm interested in, usually I'll listen in just to kind of get a sense for what you and your guests think of it. So doing good stuff.
And then it's all spoiled for you.
Yeah.
But to be fair, these things, we're up to 87 here, so they're pretty old. People have had plenty of time to watch them.
Absolutely.
Or read them. But Of course, it was great having you. And to our listeners, check out some of Seth's podcasts if you're into the sci-fi world. And as always, you can follow us at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. And thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.